Politically, America had changed as well. With the Depression now an increasingly fading memory due to the 50s prosperity and the tumultuous years of World War II behind, Americans not only enjoyed their prosperity and stability, they wanted a leader in the White House who would not rock the boat. President Truman, who won re-election on his own accord in 1948, had U.S. soldiers once again join the fight, this time under the newly minted flag of the United Nations in defending the nation of South Korea against the invasive onslaught of the North in 1950. Not one to ever shy away from rocking the boat, Truman also seemed to be slowly throwing the weight of the federal government behind civil rights activism for African Americans after he desegregated the armed forces and tried, unsuccessfully, to introduce legislation that would ban racial discrimination in any government job. This was a bit too much for the very conservative lifestyle of Southern whites. Americans wanted a change, and when Truman decided not to run for president again in '52, Americans would put the first Republican in the White House in 20 years, as former General Dwight D. Eisenhower won 55% of the popular vote. "I like Ike" buttons and posters said it all for this new president. He would fight communism abroad, but also work to ensure and maintain stability at home. Vice President Richard Nixon also skillfully used the new medium of television to convince voters that Republicans were the party that would protect Americans and American values. And with that, in 1952, a 20-year chapter of Democratic leadership and political domination was concluded. The American Dream. Throughout American history, the dream that its people held on to changed and altered from time to time, but prosperity, that is the hope of forever escaping from poverty's grasp, permeated. It was no different in the 1950s. The dream that Americans en masse seemed to latch onto at this time emanated out of a sense of stable prosperity and revolved around three things: owning one's own home, owning at least one car, and having plenty of disposable money to spend on the increasing distractions 50s culture would offer the well-to-do consumer. Businesses were booming in the 1950s, offering more and more higher-paying white-collar positions than ever before, and as a result, Americans had more spending money than ever before. Thanks to the labor laws instituted by the Wagner Act during the Depression, Americans had more leisure time than ever before to spend this money. And because Americans were spending, more and more businesses arose. As Americans poured millions of dollars into buying cars, a product denied to them throughout much of the 40s because of the war, spending that free time Americans had revolved more and more around using the car to do so. Drive-in restaurants, such as McDonald's or In-N-Out Burgers, sprouted up across suburban America. Drive-in movie theaters, much to the delight of teenage couples everywhere, also made their appearance during the 1950s. And speaking of randy teenagers, the 18-year period immediately following World War II became known as the baby boom. When you combine all of GIs returning to their wives and girlfriends after the war with the economic prosperity that ensued from the late 1940s, you have a climate in which starting a family, even a large family of say 5 or 6 kids, was something a middle-class family and a middle-class income could easily accommodate. The birth rate in America rapidly skyrocketed up from 1945 until the early 1960s. Some 40 million Americans were born during this period, adding roughly another 25% onto our population. In 1957, one infant was born every 7 seconds, meaning that nearly 4.3 million children were born that year. This dramatic increase would decrease after 1960 due to a number of significant factors, including the development of the birth control pill, as well as a decline in America's economy as the Vietnam War heated up and more women started to attend college. But the baby boomers would last with us through the present. In fact, in the year 2010, the youngest baby boomers turned 65, and that's significant because that is the age of retirement. Next year, in 2010, the baby boom starts withdrawing money from Social Security, a situation some economists predict could cause great hardship for that New Deal program that provides retirement income to so many millions of Americans, and hopefully for more millions to come. Medical science made significant changes in the lives of Americans as Dr. Jonas Salk developed a vaccine which would nearly wipe out polio throughout America and the world in the 1950s. Dr. Benjamin Spock released his Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, which would revolutionize how parents cared for their young. Over 10 million copies were bought in the 1950s, and families were encouraged not to spank or scold their children. Instead, to share and discuss family issues rationally, in which all members could freely express their feelings. With the baby boom came an increase in demand on both childhood leisure and education. In 1958, toy sales reached $1.25 billion, an all-time high. 10 million new children enrolled in elementary schools, and all of a sudden, teaching seemed to be a career whose promise knew no end. In California, a new school was opening every 7 days. Despite the fact that TV shows like Father Knows Best and The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, that's Ozzie Nelson, not Ozzy Osbourne, reinforced the notion that American women should not work outside the house and instead stay at home and tend to their children, 40% of mothers held paying jobs. The car seemed to define America during the 50s. During the 50s, Americans would buy an additional 20 million automobiles, making the total in this country leap from 40 million in 1950 to 60 million in 1960. Cars and gas were cheap. A new car could be had for less than $1,000, and gas was roughly 20 cents per gallon. It made sense for households with multiple children to have multiple cars, one for the husband to get to work, one for the wife to run her errands, and even one or two for the older children to drive to and from school and their other various destinations. In 1956, President Eisenhower authorized the Interstate Highway Act, which led to the construction of 41,000 miles of expressways across the country. This act directly led to the modern forms of Highway 80 and 5 we're so comfortable driving on today. These roads were better constructed and more efficiently connected than the roads of the past, such as Route 66, and cities were more interconnected than ever before. As a result, long-haul trucking as a form of transporting goods dramatically increased during the 50s, and the use of commercial railroad transportation has been steadily declining ever since. Despite all of these four-wheeled blessings, increased reliance upon the car had some serious drawbacks of both the immediate and long-term nature. Engine and horn noise filled city streets as exhaust polluted city air. Today in Los Angeles County, an infant has a 1 in 6 chance of contracting asthma simply from the air around him. Car accidents claimed more and more lives each year, as during the 1950s, seatbelts weren't compulsory. Automobiles didn't even have to have them. Nor were there airbags or engineering inside or outside the cars that would help shield those caught in an accident. Traffic jams soon clogged up the expressways around cities, adding to the stress people felt, and road rage was born. Further, more cars on the roads meant more roads wore out faster, in some cases faster than the federal or state governments could afford to fix them. Further, with more people rather using cars to get around, public transportation suffered and declined, which as a result left the poor who couldn't afford cars stranded to only where their legs could take them. Consumerism flourished in the 1950s as Americans had more cash to spend than ever before. Adding to the list of all the consumer goods the 20s brought us were television sets, tape recorders, 8mm movie cameras and photographic cameras, high-fidelity record players, powered lawnmowers, barbecues, swimming pools, lawn decor for suburban homes. Americans were buying in such record numbers that businesses had to actually change the strategy of how they made products if they wished consumption to continue. Enter planned obsolescence, the practice of designing products that would specifically fall apart after a limited amount of use, simply in order to get people to buy more of the same product. This began in the 1950s. Americans were, year after year, shown new and improved versions of the cars, TVs, clothes, whatever product they owned. Americans were bombarded with ads to keep them spending on the next big thing, which usually was just a minor, itty-bitty superficial adjustment over the last big thing.